Well, hi there. So in this video, we're going to be learning about the fundamentals of national debts and deficits. Really, where we're going is what are the implications of having a large national debt, both from a fiscal perspective and from a monetary perspective. So let's get started. Okay, so the first part about this one is just some basic kind of terms to know related to debt and deficits. The big picture to kind of keep in mind when we talk about national debts in this class is that there's AP and macro world, and then there's like kind of just knowing this for your own benefit world. Some of this information, especially the information that's really specific to the United States, is not going to be on an AP test or anything like that, but I still think it's valuable for you to understand. So the first little section, though, is definitely something that's AP possible. Debt and deficits, like what are they? Governments will borrow when tax receipts, that's to say the amount of money that the government takes in, is less than what they spend, which they spend on spending and transfers. And in the United States and in many other countries, that's pretty common. That leads to what's called a deficit. Now, when they borrow money, the annual amount that they borrow is called the deficit. The alternate world would be if they had a balanced budget or they actually took in more than they spent, and that would be called a budget surplus. A budget surplus is pretty rare in the United States. The last time it happened was the late 1990s, and before that it was quite some time. The cumulative, the total amount of everything that's been borrowed, in addition to if there's been any savings and surpluses, is what we call the debt. And so knowing the difference between those two terms is really important. Generally speaking, governments will borrow to do stabilization policy. We've talked a lot about how in a recession, a government will want to cut taxes or spend more money. That happens automatically. They will automatically collect less taxes because of automatic stabilizers like the progressive income tax system. And they'll also automatically spend more money through things like unemployment benefits and food stamps and other kinds of assistance programs that stabilize the economy automatically. So in a recession, which is something that we kind of always contend with at some point, governments are usually going to borrow money. As a result, though, over time, using those fiscal tools for just stabilization will create budget deficits and debts and a debt, right? A national debt. At the same time, if you're not kind of judicious about that, if in good times you're still running a deficit, like in good times, not recessions and expansions, you're running big deficits, that's a sign that maybe you have a persistent budget deficit issue. And there are really kind of four different issues that we want to summarize here. The first two are going to happen regardless of the type of country that you have. First, you've got a high opportunity cost. What would you have done instead of paying interest on the debt? In the United States, for 2025, that interest on the debt is going to close in on $1 trillion. You could pay for free college for everybody. You could pay for pre-K for everybody. You could do some tax cuts along with that. To do $1 trillion in interest, right? That's the interest on the debt. That's not reducing the debt. That's literally just paying the interest on the debt alone. You could do an enormous number of things from that. And when I tell my students about that, and I go, 10 years ago, we talked about free college for everybody and things like that. The interest on the debt 10 years ago was about $250 billion a year. You could have done free college with that. But now the interest on the debt is 4 times as high. Think of all the things that basically, because your generation is burdened with paying this interest, right, and paying the debt eventually, or kind of in a kind of general sense, paying this debt, you're being burdened with choices that your forebears made. And I don't feel like that's very fair to you, but that's my own personal normative side. Second, you run the risk of the inability to repay. This is called a default. And a default would be catastrophic. When I say major disruptions, I mean major. This is one that doesn't easily come back from. Countries that have defaulted on their debts, that have basically said, we're not going to pay this month, we're going to skip paying the interest on these bonds, or no, you're going to need to wait to get your payments back if you've lent us money. Those countries often experience severe economic consequences that are very hard for their countries to recover from. Russia, for example, experienced a default, and for 25 years, they've lived essentially under Vladimir Putin, who helped them out of that. Argentina was a developed country. I mean, it was a developed country. They were kind of really on top in terms of South America, and they had a default, and then their economy collapsed. Right? It was shaky to begin with, but there are bad things that happen when you default, and that's a risk, right? When you have persistently large deficits that are creating a debt that can become unmanageable. Then you have two possible things that can happen. In economies with little international trade, budget deficits often lead to crowding out, which we've talked about ad nauseum in this class, but it can slow your economic growth. The other alternative world is in economies with lots of trade, budget deficits often go along with what are called trade deficits. They're even called the twin deficits. And excuse me, the reasoning behind why it happens is a little bit complex, but I think you're smart enough to follow it. In short, let's say the government borrows money, When they borrow money, money is going to flow into the US loanable funds market. Foreigners would say, oh, I'll lend my money to the US government. I'll get a good interest rate with that. When those foreigners do that, they need to buy dollars. To do this, to do must buy dollars. And so when they buy the dollars, the US currency value goes up, right? And that's the foreigners buying dollars to lend to the government, right? You can't lend the US government yen. You can't lend to the US government Chinese renminbi or euro or, whatever. You have to lend them dollars. And so the foreign folks would go and say, well, I want to buy some dollars in a foreign exchange market. And the effect of that is to make the value of the dollar go up. When that occurs, people like me who are Americans, my dollar can buy more foreign goods because my dollar is more valuable. And so this kind of budget deficit actually fuels me purchasing things from other countries. It fuels the trade deficit. So no amount of tariffs in the world is going to stop that, right? The massive force of the money flowing in to pay for the budget deficit, right? That's going to bid up the price of the dollar, and that allows me to buy more stuff from other countries, even if those things are more expensive as a result of, say, tariffs or quotas or other trade barriers. Now, there are some other issues outside of fiscal world. Monetary world can be influenced and have problems because of national debt. There's usually a big pressure to do what's called monetizing the debt. And this just means literally print dollars to pay debt or to pay the bills or bills, right? So in most countries, they have some kind of mechanisms to prevent that political pressure from happening. But when you get a huge national debt, central banks can be under an enormous amount of pressure. And that pressure to inflate away the debt, to basically create more money to make it easier to pay off the national debt, is what we refer to as monetizing the debt. That inflation would help borrowers and obviously the indebted government. So this leads to sometimes called a nickname for what's called the inflation tax. And in a country where they allow for high inflation, right? If you're the central bank and you're trying to help basically the government, you have kind of two ways to do it. One is you could allow high inflation, and that actually helps the government pay off its debt because they have borrowed money, so they get to pay the money back easier. The other way is, if you're the central bank, you can literally print the money to pay the debt, right? Both of those, though, create inflation, and that inflation erodes the value of people's savings. It takes away from your savings. It says your $1,000 in your savings account doesn't buy as much stuff. Now, the government didn't directly come into your savings account and say, mine, right? They didn't do that. And the central bank didn't do that either. It was very, very kind of pernicious. It's undercover, right? And that's what makes it so evil in a way. It's normatively bad. But like the inflation tax is really a hidden tax. And it's a hidden tax on savers by basically saying we're going to allow inflation so that the government can pay its bills, right? Rather than actually paying the bills in a decent, normal way. The last thing I'll share with you is that money neutrality theory, which is kind of an expanding upon that quantity theory we talked about in the last topic. It's really an explanation for why in the long run, more money only leads to inflation. This is key here, that in fact, just because you could create more money, you could stimulate the economy for a little bit of time, but in the long run, money neutrality theory tells us that there's no effect on the economy that the central bank can really do when it changes the money supply, except cause inflation. Let me explain why that's true. Now, in the short run, when we change the money supply, it could change the interest rate, and that would make aggregate demand go up. So we're going to actually start with a money market in an aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. And I want to show you why or how this whole process happens. So this is our money market. Oh, it's labeled right above it. Duh. ADAS, also labeled right above it. And our standard money market has a downward sloping demand curve. That's people's need for money. And then a vertical supply curve for money. That's created by the central bank. And this is our I star rate of interest, policy rate, if you want to call it that. And then you've got aggregate demand, and you've got short run aggregate supply. Now, I'm going to leave off the LRAS just because it gets a little bit confusing if we go too far with that. But you could add it on there. Whoops, that should be A. That should be A. We are starting at point A. And now let's say that they increase the supply of money. They buy bonds, right? Maybe they want to juice the economy and fix things up a little bit. So they increase the supply of money, and that pushes the interest rate down to, we'll say, I1, and we'll label that one point B. Now, the effect of that lower interest rate is to encourage more aggregate demand. So we're going to label that one AD1 because it goes along with S1, and that's going to be point B. Now, in the short run, yeah, you got more output and you got more jobs, right? Cool, great. But it doesn't always stay that way. Now, as a result of these higher prices, notice demand pull inflation happened. As a result of those higher prices, people start to think, gee, I need more money to buy stuff with. I wish I could have more money to buy stuff with because I got to buy my groceries. I got to pay rent. Prices of everything have risen, and they need more money to actually do those transactions. One of the money demand shifters is inflation. And literally, if everything gets more expensive, you need more money to do those transactions. And ultimately, your money demand curve, I didn't quite get it there, will shift such that it shifts to the right because of that higher inflation. And this should be right at about the same level, so that your initial interest rate winning down goes right back to the beginning again. Now, you would think over here aggregate demand would pull back, but people still want to spend that money. Remember, the demand curve here increased because people are spending more money. What ultimately happens in the ADAS graph, those higher prices cause people to develop inflationary expectations that ultimately reduce aggregate supply to what we're going to call SRAS2, and ultimately lead us back to the exact same amount of output that we had before and just even higher prices. Right? So that's money neutrality. It's basically saying the amount of money is neutral in terms of neutral here in terms of unemployment or output, but all you get is higher inflation, those higher prices. So hopefully this helped you kind of thinking about some of the implications of using stabilization policy and kind of the ongoing issues with debts and deficits. I hope you learned a little bit on this one. I'll see you next time.